What if I told you that the most feared man of ancient Rome, the emperor who once ruled with suspicion, cruelty, and indulgence, may have carried to his grave a secret so dark it was buried not only beneath the stone of Capri, but beneath the silence of Roman history? Tiberius, the second emperor of Rome, the man they called Perverse, lived a life of power shadowed by rumor, of poison, paranoia, and unspeakable pleasures. But when his body finally gave way, what his attendants uncovered shocked even a society accustomed to blood and excess. His corpse told a story his reign had hidden, of disease, deformity, and perhaps one final truth too dangerous to record. The Senate may have celebrated his death, but what was buried that day was not just a body. It was a legend of corruption, shame, and secrecy Rome itself could not afford to reveal. Picture this. The year is 37 CE. The once mighty Emperor Tiberius lies in a villa on the island of Capri, the very retreat where he had exiled himself for years. The sea roars beneath jagged cliffs. Seagulls circle overhead as servants move anxiously through dim marble halls. The emperor, now 78 years old, is draped in purple robes but pale as stone, his lips cracked, his chest rising and falling with painful irregularity. For decades he ruled an empire that stretched from Britain to Judea, but in this moment he is simply a frail, broken old man. And yet whispers ripple through the palace. Is he dying of natural weakness, or is something far more sinister rotting him from within? Officially, no autopsy would be recorded in Roman annals. Emperors were not dissected like criminals or slaves, but behind closed doors, attendants prepared the body for burial, and what they saw would never be spoken in the Senate. His skin was mottled with sores, blotches of black and green spreading like ink stains across parchment. His stomach bore signs of long festering ulcers. His limbs, once powerful from years of military command, were twisted, shrunken, and weak. As they stripped the layers of imperial purple away, the smell of infection filled the chamber. Sweet, sickly, unmistakable. This was not merely age. It was decay concealed for years beneath imperial authority. Tiberius had ruled Rome with fear, yet in death his body revealed the truth. He had been dying long before he ever left Capri. The emperor's secrets, once hidden in wine-soaked feasts and guarded chambers, were now carved into his flesh. But the darkest discovery was still to come. In the closing days of his reign, Tiberius became a ghost haunting his own palace. Witnesses recorded that he drifted between long silences and sudden bursts of fury. At times, he refused food entirely, sitting upright for hours without moving, his eyes fixed on some unseen presence. Servants whispered that he muttered names under his breath, names of senators long executed, enemies long dead, as if the shadows of his victims had returned to confront him. He slept little, often pacing the halls at night, his bare feet slapping against the cold marble. Even his physicians dared not approach. Tiberius had always been suspicious, but in these final weeks, his paranoia reached fever pitch. One night, attendants found him collapsed on the floor of his chamber, blood dripping from the corner of his mouth. He waved off help, his voice hoarse yet commanding. "I will not be undone," he croaked, echoing words that would later seem chillingly prophetic. For though his body was failing, his will remained iron. He demanded that no priest be brought, no rites performed, no prayers uttered. To the very end, he clung to secrecy. But the mask was crumbling. His skin had turned ashen gray, his hands trembled violently, and his breath came in ragged wheezes. On more than one occasion, he recoiled at his reflection in polished bronze, muttering of spirits that mocked him. He accused his slaves of poisoning his wine. He demanded fresh food, then pushed it away untouched. Those who entered his chamber later described a suffocating air of dread, as if the emperor himself had become a specter before his death. When his strength finally broke, attendants rushed to his side. For a moment, it seemed the end had come. Tiberius lay still, his chest unmoving. The Praetorian prefect Macro, eager to secure the succession for Caligula, even ordered the emperor's ring removed, announcing him dead. But then something terrifying happened. The old man stirred. His eyes flickered open. His lips twitched into a ghastly smile. He was alive. Panic swept the chamber. If Tiberius recovered, those who had declared him dead might be executed for treason. Attendants froze, unsure whether to flee or bow. The emperor tried to speak, but only a rasp emerged. His body shook with the effort. And then, after one final convulsion, he collapsed again, this time for good, or so the records claim. What followed, in secret preparation of his body, would uncover the true horror that Tiberius carried to his grave, a horror that explained not only his paranoia, but his very reputation as perverse. When the body of Tiberius was finally laid out for preparation, the illusion of imperial majesty dissolved. Rome had been shown the emperor as a godlike figure draped in purple and crowned with laurel. What his attendants now uncovered was closer to a corpse that had been dying in pieces for years. The ritual began as it always did, stripping away the robes, cleansing the flesh with perfumed cloths, preparing the body for embalming. But at the first touch, horror spread through the chamber. The emperor's skin sloughed away under the warm water, peeling in sheets like old wax. His chest and back were discolored with bruises that had no origin in blows, but in sickness. Patches of blackened flesh clung stubbornly to bone, while other areas had softened into a foul, oozing rot. The smell filled the room. Sweet, metallic, putrid, so strong that even seasoned servants gagged. Worse still were the sores that marred his torso and thighs. Some were crusted and scarred from long healing, others were open, raw, and leaking. It was clear to all that these wounds had existed for years, hidden beneath layers of fine cloth and oils. A physician muttered a single word under his breath. Ulcers. Ulcers. Silent killers of the Roman elite, fed by excess and neglected until they consumed the body. But it wasn't just the surface of his skin. As they pressed lightly on his abdomen, attendants recoiled. The belly, bloated and hard, seemed filled with fluid. His once muscled frame had wasted away, but his stomach bulged unnaturally. When they lifted his arms, the joints cracked as if the bones themselves had grown brittle. The emperor, who had once marched with legions, was revealed as frail, twisted and crumbling. One disturbing detail was whispered among the attendants, never recorded in the official annals. Near his groin, the skin was inflamed, scarred by repeated infections. Rumors had long painted Tiberius as a man consumed by unspeakable lusts during his exile on Capri. Now, in death, his body bore marks that seemed to echo those stories. Whether truth or coincidence, no one dared write it down. The attendants crossed themselves in the old Roman fashion, invoking gods they no longer openly worshipped. They knew this was no ordinary corpse. This was the Emperor of Rome, and yet his body looked less like that of a ruler and more like that of a condemned criminal whose sins had finally risen to the surface. And still, the worst revelations lay hidden deeper, waiting to be exposed. Though Rome would never allow an emperor's autopsy to be publicly recorded, what happened inside that chamber on Capri was remembered in whispers. The attendants, fearful yet compelled, opened the emperor's body in a crude inspection. What they found shocked even men accustomed to battlefield carnage. Tiberius's organs were not simply aged, they were ruined. The liver, believed by Roman physicians to be the seat of vitality, was shriveled, blackened, and stiff. Instead of the healthy, fleshy mass they expected, it crumbled under touch like dried parchment. The kidneys, once thought to filter the humors of the body, were hard and stony. A physician described them in hushed tones as like pebbles wrapped in flesh. The lungs, scarred and thickened, bore signs of long years of infection, as though every breath had been a labor. But it was the emperor's stomach that provoked the greatest horror. When opened, a gush of dark fluid poured forth, thicker than blood, almost tar-like in texture. The stench was overwhelming, chemical and metallic, burning the nostrils of all who stood nearby. It clung to the hands of the attendants, refusing to wash away with water. Some whispered it was black bile, one of the 4 humors described by Galen. Others muttered that it was poison, that the emperor had been slowly consuming it for years, whether by accident or design. Even stranger was what they found near the lower abdomen. The intestines were twisted and swollen, the tissue mottled with abscesses. One section had ruptured internally, spilling infection throughout his body. The swelling explained the emperor's bloated belly and his agonizing final months. Yet even in such a state, Tiberius had continued to rule, issuing commands and letters from Capri, his body slowly rotting around him. Modern historians suggest the cause was likely cirrhosis, stomach ulcers turned septic, or even long-term lead poisoning, drawn from Roman wine sweetened with lead acetate, or from water carried through pipes of the same metal. Whatever the source, the result was unmistakable. His body was a battlefield of disease, eaten alive from within. The attendants exchanged fearful glances. Rome had worshipped its emperors as near divine. But here, laid open before them, was no god. This was a man consumed by his appetites and undone by his own flesh. Still, the most disturbing revelation was not the decay of his organs, but something more intimate, something that threatened the very image Rome had crafted of its emperor. When the attendants examined the frame of Tiberius more closely, the illusion of strength that had once terrified Rome collapsed entirely. His posture in life had always been stiff, almost statuesque, but now the reason was clear. His spine curved unnaturally, the vertebrae pressing sharply against the thin skin of his back. Years of age, disease, and confinement on Capri had twisted his body into something bent and uneven. His shoulders sloped downward, one higher than the other, giving the impression of a man permanently weighed down by invisible chains. His ribs told an equally disturbing story. Some were deformed, others had collapsed inward, pressing against the chest cavity. What should have been the cage protecting the emperor's lungs and heart looked instead like a collapsed ruin, as though the body itself had surrendered to gravity and time. The compression explained his shallow, wheezing breath in his final days, every inhale a struggle against a chest that no longer expanded as it should. But the most grotesque discovery was the swollen mass found near his chest and collarbone. A soft, ulcerated tumor, inflamed and oozing, sat like a hidden parasite beneath the surface. The skin surrounding it was bruised and dark, suggesting it had grown for years, perhaps decades. Whether it was a cancerous growth, an infected abscess, or something neither Roman physicians nor modern science could easily explain, it was clear the emperor had lived with agonizing pain, concealing it beneath his robes, never allowing his court to know. The attendants whispered nervously. They knew the empire was watching. Tiberius had already been painted by rumor as a perverse and monstrous ruler, and now his body seemed to echo the stories. Some dared to speculate that the deformities were divine punishment, Rome's gods marking him for his sins. Others insisted it was the natural decay of age. None could say for certain, but all agreed it was too dangerous to speak of openly. The darkest whispers came from those who inspected his groin. They found the flesh scarred, discolored, and marked by repeated infections. To Romans who had long whispered of his unspeakable pleasures on Capri, this discovery felt like proof of corruption made flesh. Whether those tales were exaggeration or truth hardly mattered. The emperor's body now carried the evidence of excess, the signature of a man consumed by appetites that even death could not disguise. What lay beneath his crown was no god, no untouchable ruler, but a man broken, twisted and marked forever by the very vices that had earned him his infamous name. Tiberius the Perverse. Among the attendants, there was one detail so unsettling it was scarcely whispered and never committed to the official record. When the inspection reached the emperor's reproductive organs, what they found was not the virile body of Rome's master, but a ruin of flesh. The tissue was withered, scarred, and discolored, marked by years of chronic infection. Some described it as shriveled to the texture of old parchment, others as swollen in unnatural places, ulcerated and leaking. Whatever the reality, it shocked those present. For decades, Tiberius had been the subject of salacious rumor. Exiled on Capri in his later years, he was accused of perversions so extreme that later historians like Suetonius struggled to describe them without recoiling. Stories spoke of swimming pools filled with children forced into his games, of acts so humiliating they became whispered warnings in Roman households. Whether these accounts were exaggeration, propaganda, or truth, they had fixed his reputation as Rome's most depraved emperor. And now, in death, his body bore signs that seemed to lend weight to the legends. Roman physicians had no name for what they saw, but modern science suggests possibilities. Advanced venereal disease, untreated infections, or perhaps syphilitic lesions that eroded flesh over decades. The groin showed scars of repeated irritation, evidence of suffering hidden beneath the silks of imperial robes. Whatever the diagnosis, the symbolism was unmistakable. The emperor, who ruled through fear and indulged through secrecy, was undone by the very part of his body that defined his reputation. One attendant reportedly crossed himself not with the sign of Jupiter or Mars, but in the old Christian gesture, a sign still dangerous in a Rome that persecuted believers. He whispered that the emperor's corruption had not been rumor alone, but visible in his very body, as though the gods themselves had branded him with shame. The others remained silent. They knew speaking such truths would mean death. Thus, the discovery was buried twice, once in the coffin beneath the stones of Rome, and once in the silence of those who saw it. Tiberius's body became not just the end of a man, but a final warning of what happens when power and appetite devour each other. The Senate would celebrate his passing, Caligula would inherit the empire, and the people of Rome would move on. But within the cold chamber on Capri, the secret of Tiberius's body lingered, a truth too grotesque to ever reach the Roman Forum. The moment word spread that Tiberius had finally died, the palace erupted into chaos. His attendants may have seen a frail, ruined body, but to the Senate and the Praetorian Guard, his corpse was still dangerous. For years, Rome had lived under the shadow of his suspicion, his letters from Capri capable of condemning senators, generals, or even family members to death. Now, with his body cooling on the marble slab, the machinery of empire shifted with brutal precision. The Praetorian prefect Macro moved swiftly, ensuring that Caligula, not any rival, would claim the imperial ring. Yet even as the empire prepared to transition, whispers of what had been seen in the death chamber began to stir. If word spread that Tiberius had died, deformed, diseased, and corrupted, it could unravel more than his reputation. To Romans, the emperor was not just a man. He was the embodiment of divine order. His body, like the body of the state itself, was supposed to be whole, unblemished, favored by the gods. To reveal that the emperor's flesh had rotted into sores and tumors would be to invite panic, and so silence was enforced. Attendants were sworn to secrecy, threatened with execution should they speak of what they had seen. The inspection was dismissed as rumor. Official proclamations described the emperor's death as serene, his body as preserved in dignity. No mention was made of the sores, the blackened organs, or the grotesque growths. Instead, the Senate declared him deified in the traditional manner, though privately many cheered his passing. But even in silence, fear remained. Some senators feared that if the people knew the emperor had been consumed by disease, it would be seen as divine punishment, a sign that Rome itself had fallen out of favor with the gods. Others worried the revelations would undermine the authority of his successor, Caligula, whose legitimacy was fragile. Better to bury the truth with the body than risk instability in the empire. Tiberius was placed in a coffin lined with stone and lead, sealed away before any more questions could arise. Priests conducted rituals that emphasized his power in life, avoiding all mention of his decay and death. The crowd in Rome was told only of his victories and his long reign. The truth of his body, its sores, its infections, its humiliating disfigurements, was entombed not only in his sarcophagus, but in a conspiracy of silence. And yet fragments of the secret leaked out in whispers, in letters, and in the writings of those bold enough to hint at what the official record denied. Centuries later, when historians put quill to parchment, the death of Tiberius was remembered not in solemn dignity, but in tones of disgust and fascination. The official proclamations had spoken of a long, orderly reign and a calm passing, but men like Tacitus and Suetonius told a different story, one riddled with whispers, rumors, and details too lurid to ignore. Tacitus wrote of Tiberius's paranoia, his secret exile on Capri, and the atmosphere of fear that lingered in Rome until his final breath. He hinted that the emperor's end had not been peaceful, but poisoned with suspicion. Suetonius went further, describing grotesque tales of perversion, of pools filled with young boys forced into obscene acts, of appetites that twisted the very soul of the emperor. Some of these accounts were almost certainly propaganda, sharpened by senators who despised him. And yet, when paired with the hidden state of his corpse, they felt disturbingly plausible. Other writers preserved fragments of even darker rumors, that Tiberius's body had been so ravaged that attendants recoiled when preparing him for burial, that his face was blotched with sores, that his belly had burst with foul humors. None dared record it directly, but the echoes remained. Letters discovered in aristocratic estates mention the corruption of the emperor's flesh, and a smell not of death, but of punishment. The problem for historians is simple. How much was exaggeration, and how much was truth? Rome had always used rumor as a weapon, and Tiberius, hated by both Senate and people, was an easy target. Yet diseases leave their own undeniable traces. The sores, the bloating, the failing organs, all align with the physical realities of chronic infection and poisoning. His groin, so ruined in death, matched too well with the salacious rumors of his lust-filled exile. Propaganda may have sharpened the image, but the body itself provided its own evidence. What makes Tiberius unique is how his legend fused with his flesh. His reign was remembered as cruel, paranoid, and perverse, and in death his body became the proof that Rome's gossip had not been entirely false. Even if exaggerated, the narrative was too powerful to erase. The emperor had lived as a monster, and his body had confirmed it. But what if the decay was not simply the product of indulgence or disease? What if there was another hand at work, one that had carefully managed his death to ensure his shame lived on forever? No Roman emperor's death was free from suspicion, and Tiberius was no exception. For decades, whispers persisted that his grotesque end was not entirely natural. Some said his organs collapsed under years of indulgence and disease, but others pointed to a far more sinister explanation: poison. The Praetorian prefect Macro, who had already betrayed his master once by plotting in favor of Caligula, loomed large in these theories. Ancient sources suggest that Macro, desperate to secure his position, ensured the emperor would never rise again after his apparent recovery. When Tiberius briefly stirred and smiled that ghastly smile, attendants panicked. Some accounts claim Macro smothered the old emperor with a blanket, silencing him forever. Others whisper he administered a draught of poison, disguised in wine, ensuring that the emperor's suffering would end on command. But what of the strange fluids, the blackened organs, the sores and tumors? To many Romans, these were proof of poison, a body corroded from within. Ancient poisons were not always swift. Some acted slowly, weakening the body over months or even years. Arsenic, lead, and mercury, all known in Rome, could rot flesh, cause convulsions, and blacken organs. Was Tiberius's grotesque decay the result of years of deliberate poisoning, administered by servants on Capri under orders from Macro or Caligula? Modern historians argue otherwise. They point to his excessive drinking of wine sweetened with lead acetate, a common Roman practice. Over years, this would have poisoned his blood, scarred his organs, and driven him into madness. In this sense, Tiberius poisoned himself, slowly and unknowingly, every time he lifted a goblet. Yet the overlap with accounts of political murder leaves room for doubt. The foul black fluid in his stomach, the bloated belly, the sudden convulsions before death. These could match either natural decay or deliberate poisoning. The truth may lie somewhere in between. A sickly old man, his body collapsing under years of indulgence, may have been hastened into death by those eager for his throne. In Rome, where power shifted on a knife's edge, mercy and murder often wore the same face. What mattered to the Senate and the people was not how Tiberius died, but how his death could be told. To admit poison, disease, or corruption was to undermine the empire itself. And so the story became one of silence, myth, and deliberate forgetting. But even in silence, one secret remained, a secret that turned Tiberius's body into more than a corpse. It became a symbol Rome itself dared not acknowledge. In Rome, an emperor was more than a ruler. He was the living embodiment of the state. His body mirrored the empire itself. When Augustus stood tall and youthful, Rome imagined itself eternal. But when Tiberius's corpse was laid bare, riddled with sores, twisted by disease and bloated with corruption, it became impossible not to see a reflection of Rome's own soul. The empire in 37 CE was wealthy, sprawling, and mighty, but beneath the marble temples and endless legions, rot had already set in. To his enemies, the grotesque body of Tiberius was proof of divine justice. They whispered that the gods had marked him for his cruelty and perversion, that the ulcers and tumors were punishments etched into his flesh. Senators who despised him saw the corpse as vindication. Rome had suffered under a diseased ruler, and his body was the testimony. For the people, who remembered him as the emperor who withdrew to Capri and left them to the whims of corrupt prefects, his withered body symbolized abandonment. Rome itself seemed abandoned, festering under the weight of secrecy and suspicion. Even those who sought to bury the truth could not ignore its power. The very act of silencing attendants, of sealing the coffin swiftly, was an acknowledgement of the danger his body posed. His death was more than an end. It was a mirror held up to the empire. The emperor who had once ruled through fear now revealed in his death what Rome most feared about itself. Corruption hidden beneath splendor, sickness festering beneath discipline, shame disguised as order. And then came the final whisper, the one secret never told in public, but hinted at in the writings of those who dared. Some claimed that in death, Tiberius's body showed signs not only of decay, but of ambiguity. His reproductive organs, scarred and shriveled, provoked speculation not just about disease, but about identity itself. Was the emperor who indulged in grotesque appetites driven by sickness, or by something far deeper, something Rome itself could never name? The answer was buried with him, sealed in silence, because to question the emperor's body was to question the very foundations of imperial rule. For 4 centuries after, his name carried the stench of corruption. Even when the empire reached its height under his successors, Tiberius remained the ghost in Rome's memory, the emperor whose flesh betrayed the truth Rome dared not speak aloud. Nearly 2,000 years after his death, historians and medical experts still peer into the shadows of Tiberius's final days, trying to separate propaganda from pathology. Without access to his remains, lost to time and sealed within the ruins of imperial tombs, scholars have turned instead to ancient accounts, Roman medicine, and forensic parallels. What emerges is not a single cause, but a chilling portrait of overlapping afflictions. First, the sores and ulcers. Roman writers describe him as plagued by them in life, and attendants in death noted their grotesque spread. Modern doctors suggest advanced peptic ulcers, stomach cancers, or cirrhosis of the liver. Each would explain the foul stench, the bloating of his abdomen, and the blackened organs described in whispers. Combined with heavy drinking, a staple of Roman elite life, cirrhosis seems not only possible, but likely. Then there is the mystery of the dark, tar-like fluid said to pour from his stomach. To Roman eyes, this was black bile, a humor associated with melancholy and madness. To modern science, it looks like evidence of internal bleeding, perhaps a ruptured ulcer spilling blood into his gut. This alone could account for his convulsions and sudden collapse. Lead poisoning is another piece of the puzzle. Roman wine was often sweetened with lead acetate, and water flowed through lead pipes. Chronic exposure could scar the kidneys, blacken the liver, and affect the brain, leading to paranoia, tremors, and hallucinations, all symptoms described in Tiberius's final months. His hands shook, his eyes grew wild, his temper snapped with little provocation, classic signs of neurological damage. And then, the most troubling discovery, the disfigurement in his groin. While Roman writers tied this to his reputation for perversion, medical historians suggest venereal disease. Untreated infections could easily scar, ulcerate, and disfigure the flesh, leaving precisely the marks whispered about in the death chamber. Whether syphilis, which some argue did not exist in Europe until later, or another chronic infection, the evidence suggests years of silent suffering hidden beneath robes of power. The result is a portrait of an emperor consumed not by a single illness, but by many. Ulcers, cirrhosis, infections, and heavy metal poisoning combining into a slow, humiliating collapse. In death, his body became not only a medical puzzle, but a grotesque confirmation of his reputation. Yet for all that science reveals, one final mystery remains. Why did Rome bury the truth so carefully? Was it simply to protect the empire's dignity, or to hide a secret even darker? For all the grotesque details whispered in hidden letters and preserved in hostile histories, there was still one aspect of Tiberius's death that Rome refused to name. Attendants who prepared his body were dismissed, silenced, or reassigned far from Capri. Those who spoke, even in veiled terms, disappeared from records. The secrecy was not just about disease, nor even about the corruption of flesh. It was about what his body symbolized and what it threatened to expose. Some later accounts, written in cautious phrases, hinted at ambiguity in his anatomy. The ruined groin was described as neither fully functional nor entirely masculine, fueling speculation that Tiberius may have suffered from a congenital disorder or hormonal imbalance. To the Romans, obsessed with virility as a measure of legitimacy, such a revelation would have been catastrophic. An emperor who was physically deformed in the very seat of masculinity would not only be mocked, but seen as cursed by the gods. For a ruler already hated, it would have provided proof that his reign was illegitimate, unnatural, even monstrous. Others suggest the secrecy was more political. By the time of his death, Tiberius had become a hated recluse, reviled for his cruelty and excess. If the people learned that his body was diseased, poisoned, and disfigured, it might be interpreted as divine punishment, not just of him, but of Rome itself. To prevent unrest and to preserve the dignity of the empire, silence became doctrine. The official record described him as an emperor who died peacefully, his body intact, his legacy preserved. But silence, too, is evidence. The speed with which his body was sealed, the lack of public display, and the control over information all point to something so dangerous it could not be spoken. Perhaps it was simply the grotesque spectacle of disease, or perhaps it was something that cut to the heart of Roman identity. An emperor whose very body contradicted the ideals of masculinity, strength, and divine favor. What is certain is that the secret was buried with him, entombed in stone, hidden beneath centuries of dust. Rome chose myth over truth, dignity over decay. Yet the whispers persisted, carried forward by historians, priests, and physicians who knew that even the mightiest empire could not conceal the truth forever. And so the question remains, what did they really find inside Tiberius the Perverse's body? Disease, corruption, and shame, yes, but perhaps also the most dangerous secret of all, one Rome itself could never afford to tell.